Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. We're going to go ahead and get started. This webinar today will be presenting analysis from our latest report, Achieving 100% Clean Electricity in the Southeast, Enacting a Federal Clean Electricity Standard. This is one of 4 webinars on the report, and it is focusing today on the Tennessee Valley Authority. We will be sending out an email later today with recordings to all of the webinars that we have hosted so far. And there is one more this afternoon on Southern Company if you're interested in joining that. Just a few housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded. So like I said, we'll be sending it out to you via email, the recording, if you can't stay for the whole time or want to rewatch. We will be accepting questions during the webinar, and after the presentation, we will go ahead and answer those questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. If you're with a publication, if you could please denote which publication you are with, that would be great. We will not be monitoring the chat box during this webinar, so please keep all of your questions to the Q&A box. If for some reason we do not get to your question during the webinar, we will either follow up with you or we will have some contact information on our screen at the end of the presentation, and you can follow up with us. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Stephen Smith, who is the director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Sound quality okay? We're good?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, so again, my name is Stephen Smith. I'm the executive director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. SACE is a regional nonprofit energy and environmental policy organization that does work throughout the Southeast. We're trying to reduce the environmental footprint of how we produce and consume energy. And so we're happy to bring this webinar forward as part of the webinar series looking at the Clean Electricity Standard. I just want to say a few opening comments about the importance of this moment. We have just seen President Biden complete a international tour meeting with world leaders, which climate change was an important part of the topic as the United States is re-engaging in the international community on climate change. We know that across the world and across our country, we're seeing unprecedented climatic changes. We're in the grips of an historic drought in the West. We've seen unprecedented wildfires through vast amounts of the Western United States. We know in the Southeast, our own territory, that we have a vast coastline that is subject to flooding, sea level rise. We were just talking yesterday about Florida and the fact that we see a great deal of literally hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure built right along the coast. And today, as we're talking about the Tennessee Valley, it is important to realize that the Tennessee Valley area is also not immune at all from climatic changes. We're seeing, again, very profound weather events. We're seeing 100-year floods that are happening much more frequently. There was actually just this week a very well-done article looking at extreme rain events in the Knoxville area that was in the Knoxville News Sentinel. And we've seen historic floods in Middle Tennessee and other parts, and we've seen other climatic changes. No one is immune from climate change. And so we need to address this issue. The good news is that we have an administration that seems to be very much focused on this. We're having a national discussion about an infrastructure plan. This infrastructure plan has a number of elements, but one of the key elements is looking at what's called the Clean Electricity Standard. My colleague Maggie Schoper will get into the specifics of that in a moment, but at a very high level, the Clean Electricity Standard is critically important because decarbonizing the utility sector is a critical step that leads to decarbonization across the broader sectors of the economy. It is only by decarbonizing the utility sector that we're going to be able to really fully decarbonize the transportation sector. So when you're looking at electric vehicles and you're looking at the options associated with that, we have to have a decarbonized electric grid in order to electrify and decarbonize transportation. it's an integral step along the way. Today, we're talking about the Tennessee Valley Authority. TVA has a long history of being a critical component of the United States infrastructure. It is an extension of the administration. It should reflect the administration's goals and priorities. And we as an organization have already called for TVA to lead in this effort, asking TVA to get to the zero carbon number by 2030 instead of 2035, which is part of the administration's goal. And we're going to talk a little bit about the pathways to do that. We believe that TVA needs a national mission like this to justify its unique position. If it can't justify that position, maybe it's time for a change. And so we're very eager to see the extension of the administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, actually get on the path to decarbonization instead of some of the other things. And we'll get into that in some of the Q&A that they're talking about right now. So with that, we move on to the next slide. I'll introduce Maggie Schober, who's going to take you through the analysis that our team did. And we look forward to Q&A later on. Maggie?
Great. Thanks, Steve. All right. So some really fantastic context there, just to kind of put us in perspective of, what are we looking at here? Why is this just so critically important? So just for our agenda today on this webinar, we're going to start out with some background. What is Clean Electricity Standard? Why have we done this report? What sort of method and assumptions did we use? Then we're going to get into kind of the main event, talk about the different pathways we looked at, the results, and then of course our conclusions and next steps. We will have a good amount of time I plan for at the end for us to have some questions and answers. That's where we've actually had some of the best kind of content and back and forth. So please do ask your questions. Put them in the Q&A box as we go, and we will get to those. And just to clarify, that the Tennessee Valley Authority does cover the section in orange that you see in the map here. This report looked at the four largest utilities in the Southeast that SACE covers. So TVA, Duke, NextEra, or Florida Power and Light, and Southern Company. So we do have webinars on each of those utilities, but today we are solely focusing on TVA. All right, so what do we mean by Clean Electricity Standard? What is this? So a Clean Electricity Standard is a policy that has three main elements. It is a policy that says a utility or a geography has to get a certain percentage of energy from a certain set of resources by a certain date. So those three elements are: what resources qualify, what percentage are you targeting, and when is the deadline for achieving that target. We call it a Clean Electricity Standard, a CES. That's been the term thrown around lately, but these kinds of policies, they're not new, and they've been called a few different things. Over 30 states, territories, DC, and in fact, the city of New Orleans all have these kinds of policies in place and have had them since, the first was in Iowa in the 1980s. So there's, sometimes they're called renewable portfolio standards, RPS, REPS, you'll hear these different acronyms used, and it's the same general idea. You need to get a certain percentage of your electricity from a certain set of resources, and usually there's a deadline or even a timeline. So sometimes you'll have percentages for each year, and they ramp up kind of as you go along. And then also on the slide, I've put a few of the current proposals at the federal level, looking at the variety of, the different proposals. They vary a little bit on these three key elements and some other pieces as well. But you can see these are all, within the last year or two, and that there are a significant number of them being proposed. All right, so leading from that and from Steve's intro as to why are we looking at this? Why this report? Why do this analysis at all? As we saw on the previous slide, there are a lot of different proposals for a federal clean electricity standard. And this is very timely because, as Steve indicated, we are seeing the impacts of climate change already. It's here, it's only getting worse. And the sooner we act, the better off we will be overall. In addition, specifically looking at the electricity sector, it is critical to decarbonize the electricity sector first. That is why the Biden administration has targeted getting to zero emissions by 2035, and then electrifying other sectors to get economy-wide emissions down to zero by about 2050. So that's a big reason to look at the clean electricity standard. It's also particularly important here in the Southeast because a CES, a clean electricity standard, would have an outsized impact on utilities here in the Southeast. There are two main reasons for that. The first is that this region has what's called vertically integrated utilities. That means that the utilities are not a part of a regional market per se, and that they are planning their system and providing power sort of, there is trading back and forth, but it's much more focused just within their service territory. Whereas in other places across the country, we've seen that there is a market construct. Sometimes they're called RTOs, regional transmission organizations, and in those locations, resources really compete on the cost of a new resource. And we've seen that because renewable energy in particular is so low cost, it's able to compete, and we haven't seen that level of renewable development here in the Southeast, where new generation is primarily driven through what's called integrated resource plans, or IRPs. And each utility does its own individual IRP here in the Southeast. The second reason why a CES would have an outsized impact here in the Southeast is, oops, hold on guys, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I just got a warning that my internet was unstable, so I wasn't sure if I was just speaking to a blank screen or not. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so two main reasons that a federal clean electricity standard would have an outsized impact here in the Southeast. One of them is that we don't have markets. The other one is that we don't have the state level policies. As I mentioned on the other slide, over 30 states and entities around the country have these kinds of policies. In the Southeast, it's just North Carolina and the city of New Orleans. And everywhere else, there aren't the state level policies that require a certain percentage of clean or renewable electricity by a certain date. All right, so what we were going for with this report and this analysis is really to look at what does 100% clean electricity look like here in the Southeast, and to start a conversation. So we want folks, customers, policymakers, regulators, utilities, to start talking about this and the different options we have to get to 100% clean energy, and really shift the conversation away from, is this possible? Can we do this? And towards, how can we do this? How do we do this? I'll also note upfront that this analysis is not least cost optimization. That's typically a process that utilities use for their resource planning, and that's not what we did here. This also isn't transmission or power flow analysis. We did look a little bit at transmission between the different utilities, but we're not looking, real detailed at different power flows. And then finally, and also important, is that we're going to present some figures for how much of solar, how much energy efficiency, different utilities have in different pathways toward 100% clean electricity. These figures aren't the maximum amount that they could achieve of any of these resources. All right, so a quick snapshot on our method and assumptions. We go into a lot more detail about what we did here in the appendix of the report. So if you are like me and really into that sort of thing, I definitely encourage you to go check that out. And feel free to ask me questions either during this webinar, or you can follow up with me afterwards, and we can talk some more of the details. But at a high level, our assumed target, this is actually not correct, my apologies. In the slide, it should be 100% clean by 2030. Because we're talking about TVA here, we did push TVA's 100% clean target up in our analysis. And we think that they can lead the industry by achieving 100% clean energy before everybody else. So we looked at a 100% clean by 2030 target for TVA. Let me just take a quick tangent and kind of go over why we think that TVA can lead in this way. I mean, it's really in line with the historical mission that TVA has served the country, the way that it was founded to really be a leader when the country needed it to, and this is absolutely that kind of a situation. And also, just technically speaking, TVA has a lot of hydro in particular, but some other zero emission resources. It has a lot of existing nuclear as well, but that hydro is really good at helping to balance out renewables, especially pumped hydro, which TVA has one of the largest pumped hydro stations in the region. It's called Raccoon Mountain, and it's a really great asset to have if you're adding a lot of solar and wind onto your system. And so the other reasons that we think that TVA would be able to meet this 2030 goal is it's very strategically located. So it's connected up to, for instance, MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. That's a very large market just to the west. And there is a whole lot of wind development already and more coming online in that market that TVA could have access to. It has transmission connections already, and those can also be expanded. And we'll look at that some more in the results here. So getting back to the assumed target, 100% clean by 2030. By clean, for this analysis, we included wind, solar, energy efficiency, existing nuclear, existing hydro, and existing biomass, landfill gas, sort of that other category. We did not include any fossil resources, and by fossil, we mean coal, we mean gas, we mean oil. All right, so the method you can see here, but I'll run through it real quick. So we started with the load forecast in the resource plan, and we removed all of the fossil resources. Again, that's any coal, any gas. Obviously also not adding any new gas here, but removing any resources that are projected to be online and operating in 2030. Then we applied our distributed energy resource assumptions, DERs, we'll call them throughout this presentation. This is a category of resources that basically means they are distributed throughout the grid. So this is your energy efficiency, distributed solar, demand response. Those are the high level categories. When we talk about these, so for instance, distributed solar, a lot of times people think rooftop solar, and there's a good bit of that, but we're also thinking that included in that category is larger projects at commercial sites, and some of your larger projects that are larger but on the distribution grid, but much smaller than the large solar farms you see that would typically connect up to the transmission system. In energy efficiency, we use this term kind of broadly, and we talk about a little bit more in the appendix what that entails. But this means some of your traditional utility energy efficiency programs. So that's when utilities providing rebates for really efficient heat pumps and efficient refrigerators and lighting and different HVAC programs. And that's at residential, commercial, industrial, all customer levels. But also in this are some innovative ideas around things like rate design. So if you can, adjust the rates to encourage folks to, use less during certain times, shift their usage or reduce their usage, and then, smart home sort of ideas. So smart thermostats, smart appliances, and really, there's a lot of the ability for innovation in this energy efficiency and demand response category. All right, so moving to the next step, which was wind. So we looked at wind next of the sort of larger renewable technologies because in the Southeast, the solar resource is a lot better than the wind resource. We thought that wind resource would be more of a limiting factor in that way. So there are 3 categories of wind here. Obviously, just 2 of them apply directly to TVA, which is the western wind, which, as I mentioned, increasing the transmission connections towards the west and bringing more of that in. And then there is a good a good onshore wind resource here in the Tennessee Valley, and with improvements, not improvements that we expect, but with improvements that have already happened with wind turbine technologies, there really is a lot of potential for that here in the Tennessee Valley to balance out the next resource that we looked at, which is if there are any gaps in the load forecast after we've applied the DERs and the wind, let's fill them with large scale solar and storage. And that's going to make sure that the resource portfolio as a whole is, number one, generating enough megawatt hours to meet the load in the entire year of 2030. That's pretty obvious. And number 2 is that it meets the reserve margin. Just a quick 101 on reserve margins. A planning reserve margin is where you have, if a utility has a peak load at 100 megawatts and your reserve margin is 15%, so you will need to have 15% of reserves above your peak load. So you would need 115 megawatts total. So we built up enough large-scale solar and storage and a little bit in an other sort of generic other renewables category to meet those reserve margins. Then the last step is that we checked each pathway that we looked at. We checked against 3 hourly load profiles for a single day. So we looked at a peak day in the wintertime, a peak day in the summertime, and a typical spring day. And these were derived from TVA's actual hourly load data. And that's just obviously for reliability. You want to make sure that you're able to provide the power for every single hour in the day. And from that, we can go back and adjust exactly how much storage is needed, how much solar is needed, and that sort of thing. All right. So what did we find? So we looked at 2 main pathways, and I'll go through those here. I'll be honest, we struggled a little bit with what to call these pathways, and I think that'll you'll understand more why as I kind of talk about them. But this is what we settled on. So the first one is a distributed energy resource DER focused pathway. And the second one is a large scale renewable focused pathway, or LSR focused pathway. So on the DER pathway, the one on the left here, that one is where energy efficiency and solar would ramp up to meet 1/3 of energy needs by 2035. When we're taking that snapshot of 2030, it's not quite that much because these programs do kind of they ramp up over time. And then we also made sure that demand response was there to help meet peak loads on peak days in both summer and winter time. And then we did have large scale resources, both storage, wind and solar, to balance out those needs on the peak days. So shifting over to the large scale renewable pathway, this one, the reason we weren't quite sure what to call it is because it still has a good amount of DERs. It still has more energy efficiency, more distributed solar, by far more than the utility's current plan. But we wanted to know what happens if the level of penetration of DERs in the first pathway just isn't, we don't quite get there. And that's, as I said, these DERs tend to take a while to kind of build up. And our assumptions here are based on not only a significant investment in these resources, but also, equally important is to sustain that investment over time. You can think about the importance in this is, if you think about, a basic energy efficiency program that's helping customers to use less electricity when they replace their air conditioner, for example, or their HVAC system. Well, not everybody is replacing that unit every year. Obviously, that would be ridiculous. So you're trying to capture, a good amount of the people that are replacing it in the first year, and then also in the second year and the third year, and et cetera, et cetera. You can see how, your investment, your sustained investment in energy efficiency really snowballs over time. And so from that, obviously, the sooner we start, the better. And the more we can sustain that high level of investment, the better outcomes you're going to get. All right, back to the LSR focused pathway. So slightly lower levels of DERs, and that includes demand response. And because the amount of demand, the amount of peak did not change, that means that there's higher levels of large scale solar and wind and storage. So basically, these pathways both have distributed and large scale resources, but the balance between the two is different from one to the other. So some common themes that we observed. The first is that a variety of resources is really important. This may seem super obvious, but if you only build solar or you only build wind, you're not really going to get there. So it's important to look at all of these. And as I mentioned when kind of explaining the distributed energy resources, it's important that we start immediately. It's also important that we start right away for the large scale renewables. Reaching this level of large scale solar, it will take time. Building some of these projects, for instance, the transmission connections, that takes time. And so it's best to start, exploring that opportunity as soon as we can. All right, so some of the results that we saw for the DER pathway. So this is a snapshot of what TVA's resource mix would look like in 2030. On the left is their current utility plan for that year, based on their 2019 IRP, which is their latest IRP. And on the right is the DER focused clean electricity, 100% clean electricity portfolio that we put together using this method. So you can see it's a pretty big shift from one to the other. Energy needs meet about 10, or energy efficiency, excuse me, meets about 10% of energy needs in 2030, and distributed solar meets about 5% of needs. So you're getting to about 15% or so total distributed resources, and that's for energy. The chart on the left is capacity. So we're showing two different things here, but that kind of helps you see what's installed and on the ground and what is meeting the energy needs day in, day out. So as I said, the remainder is largely met with large-scale solar, wind, that is both within, by local we mean within the Tennessee Valley territory, and from Western states, and then some energy storage. I'll note, I should have said this back on the assumption slide, but for storage, we assume kind of a generic storage, which is, it could be batteries, it could be pumped hydro, it could be, any sort of things, but we are fairly conservative in our assumptions about that, in that we're assuming that this is what we would call short-term storage. So when we are looking at how much storage is needed to meet load during a peak day, we did make sure that that storage could not only discharge, but could charge within that same 24-hour period. I think that will become more clear on the next slide, actually. So this is when we looked at a winter peak day for TVA. And again, this is using TVA's actual load data for an actual winter peak day that they have experienced, and looking at how our resource mix would perform on that specific day. And again, just to clarify about the storage piece, this gray that we see, that's at nighttime and is on either side of the middle of the day, is the storage discharging. This dotted line, this is where load would be without any storage charging. So you can see that this this bump in the middle is where the storage is charging up. And so basically you're having your, say their batteries, they're discharging through the night, but once the sun rises and that solar gets going, you switch to charging up your batteries throughout the day. And then once the sun sets, you're back to discharging mode. And so the area under the gray area of the storage just discharging is equal to the area of the storage charging. So that's a typical or a winter peak day. We also looked at a summer peak day, and these are again based on TVA's actual an actual peak summer day. And you can see there is the need for some storage still in this day, actually only in the evening time, not so much in the morning. And again, the storage is charging. In this case, it's actually charging from about midnight on until the sun starts setting. So you are charging the storage then from some of your wind and your solar in this example. What was interesting here is that this sort of transparent gray piece of the chart, that is excess generation. So that means that there is additional megawatt hours that are being generated that aren't needed even to charge up your storage. So we see that as an excellent opportunity. It's not typically how the grid has been operated day to day. So it would be a shift in how utilities do their day-to-day operations. But it is also this opportunity that comes from cleaning up the grid, is you have these megawatt hours, and there are different ways to use them. You can have load that can shift to when they're available. You can have ways to charge up some long-term storage with that excess generation. You can set up a way to generate hydrogen and then use that as your long-term storage. I mean, there's a lot of different options here. And then lastly is a spring day. This is a typical spring day. So we don't see in TVA or any of the utilities, we're not seeing peak load in the spring or the fall typically. And so you can see that the demand shape or the load shape here is a lot flatter. There's not as much of a peak at any point. One thing that is very notable here is you'll see, as we all know, TVA has a whole lot of nuclear capacity, nuclear generation online. And we found that if you build enough renewable resources, you deploy that energy efficiency to meet your peak demands in both winter and summer, you can actually shut off your nuclear. Even TVA with how much nuclear it has can shut off its nuclear in the springtime and the fall. That's actually really good for the plants because it's a time for them to do some maintenance and all of that. And it allows, because nuclear plants, they take a really long, they're very inflexible. They take a really long time to turn on and turn back off. Having them off for, a whole season at a time, really helps because you're not trying to, ramp them up and down because that's generally not a good way to operate a nuclear plant. And even with the nuclear offline, you can see that there is, again, a good amount of excess generation in this spring day. We would expect to see the same thing in the fall. All right, so this is my last chart, I promise. So here is a look at the large-scale renewable pathway and what that would look like, and some comparisons between this pathway and the one I presented earlier, the DER's pathway. So DERs still meet 12% of energy needs by 2030. Again, in the first one, it was 15%. Here, it's 12. It's still higher than the current utility plan, but just not quite as much. And again, that's energy needs, whereas the chart is looking at capacity. The main difference in this pathway is that we saw a lot more in-region wind in this case, about 50% more. So one and a half times as much wind as in the DER case. What was interesting here is in this one, there's actually slightly less large-scale solar, again, because of that wind. And because of that, there's slightly less storage needed in this pathway than in the DER focused pathway. As you saw on the, let me go back to one that's, as you see here, I don't know if it's super obvious, but the wind tends to generate more in the evening times, night times, and winter times, and solar obviously more in the middle of the day and also more in the summer, just by nature of us being in the northern hemisphere. And so because that the two resources are very complementary, and you just don't need as much storage if you have a more of a balance between solar and wind on your system. All right, so we did look at a few additional pathways. There was actually only one that was relevant to TVA, and that is what happens if we leave some fossil gas online for reserve margins only, but basically it's not used to meet energy. It's just there just in case. In the industry, we call this mothballed. So you have the plant ready, you do continue to maintain it so that it can come online if it is needed. And our finding there is basically we would need less storage than in the DER focus pathway, and still, because you're not using these gas plants at all, you're not emitting. The other, there's some other ideas, speculation around ways to use these plants with hydrogen, or other ways that they would be, net zero. We didn't look at that. That wasn't part of the scope here, but we, in this example, just looked at, well, what if you leave some of them online just to meet your, reserve margin targets in your planning process, but they were not available in meeting sort of day-to-day load even on those peak days. So in this example, TVA would need about 1.5 gigawatts less total storage than in the DER focus pathway. So that's a reduction of about 17%. Okay, so what did we find? First and most obvious is that 100% clean electricity is possible, and we actually do have options in how we get there, and that it's easier. The pathways would only get easier with both markets and innovation. So this first one, looking at markets, is something I talked about a little bit at the beginning. But if you are, if each utility is having to plan for its own reserve margin versus having, the region as a whole share resources, then less resources overall would be needed, and that brings any costs involved down. We have previous analysis where we've looked at, and the utilities around the region really don't peak around the same time. So this kind of method would make a lot of sense. This kind of construct would make a lot of sense here in the Southeast to help utilities share resources and reduce costs for customers. The second point on innovation. So we did this analysis based on technologies that are available today. But there's a lot going on in the R&D space around this. And sometimes it's presented as sort of an either or. Some folks are saying, well, we have the technologies today, let's just focus on deploying them. And some folks are saying, well, we need to innovate, we need better technologies before we can go. It's both. We need to both deploy and continue to invest in R&D, because the technologies that we have today are cost effective, they're absolutely doable, and they're needed, and we can continue to invest in R&D at the same time. So that ties into the second point here, which is that we really are not at risk of investing too much in these resources or too early, especially for energy efficiency and distributed solar. We present this as possible. We don't say it's going to be easy. This is a big transition and faster deployment of these resources than the utility industry has seen in 100 years. And so it's important that we start immediately, and we can't go too big on this at this point. This is something Steve touched on at the beginning, but electrification amplifies clean electricity's impact. This is kind of obvious, but not something we looked at super closely in this analysis. But that if you have cleaner electricity and you are electrifying sectors that are mostly directly combusting fossil fuels, such as transportation, buildings, then you are decarbonizing multiple sectors at the same time. And finally, this is the beginning of a conversation. More analysis is needed. And most importantly, perhaps, is that this should be a part of every utility's IRP or resource plan moving forward. So where do we go from here? First, before we start down this path, I guess, is that we need a federal electricity standard to become law. All right, and with that, that's the end of the presentation part of this, and we will turn it over to Kate to moderate our Q&A section. And here is my contact information, as well as the co-authors on the report. So please feel free to reach out to us with anything that's not covered here in this webinar.
Great, thank you, Maggie, and thank you for presenting and performing all of this really useful analysis. I want to start us off with a question that can be posed to either Steve or to Maggie, really just to kind of level set us on this Q&A portion. Why is it important to get a clean electricity standard passed? And why do we need a clean electricity standard as opposed to going through regulatory processes that are already in place?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that, and Maggie, you add in. The clean electricity standard is a critical piece of the puzzle because it is going to be applied uniformly across the board to utilities across the country. It is a federal standard. We have a hodgepodge of regulatory engagement across our region in particular. TVA does not have any regulatory oversight. The board it's a federal self-regulated monopoly that has no independent oversight whatsoever. So there is no regulatory oversight there. There is a number of state level, either utility commissions or public service commissions across the Southeast, and they are at varying degrees of effectiveness and varying degrees of what we call regulatory capture, where they tend to be less effective in really regulating. But the bottom line is that, and then there's markets across the country. When it comes to climate change, we have, in essence, what is a market failure. The market failure is that we're not internalizing the external cost of dumping all of this carbon pollution into the atmosphere, and then the implications that it has for society writ large across the globe and in our region. And when you have a market failure like that, you've got to actually correct that. And this is where a tool like a clean electricity standard, which is sending the right market signals and regulatory signals to the utilities so that they can optimize for internalizing these external factors and correcting that market failure. So it's critically important, and we've needed it for a long time because there's been a lot of uncertainty across the board for how utilities are looking at redesigning their systems. And I think having this sort of regulatory certainty that gives a clear signal allows the utilities to do the kind of planning that's necessary that corrects this market failure and gets us on the right track to solving the climate crisis.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And I think we'll just go into the next question. I think you kind of covered everything there. TVA asserts that the TVA Act requires the utility to provide electricity at the lowest feasible cost and has projected it would achieve 80% carbon reduction by 2035 with stable rates. Will achieving clean energy and zero carbon emissions by 2030 require higher rates? And to the extent it does, would that require a change in the TVA Act?
Yeah, let me jump in on this one too. First of all, as Maggie clearly stated, we did not do a cost analysis, least cost planning analysis in this report. But a couple of important points that are important to note in this question. First of all, TVA having an 80% reduction by 2035 is out of step with the stated goals of the administration, which is to get to zero by 2035. So they're out of step there. Second, there are a lot of mechanisms that are being contemplated within the clean electricity standard that allow for a moderation or a safety valve in how costs are actually going to be a factor to the utilities in trying to reach this. So there's a lot of discussion going on. We believe that there are ways to cost effectively get there. It is not a foregone conclusion by going to renewable energy and building out the renewable resources that you're necessarily going to end up at a higher cost point. And then we also know that it appears that TVA's stated desire is to potentially pursue a lot of unproven and we consider high risk financial resources like SMRs. Now they're going to try to get a lot of that offset by the federal government. We'll see if that happens, but TVA is not articulating a path to getting to zero carbon that is done in a cost-effective manner. They seem to be kind of punting on that, and they're talking about, again, some of these unproven technologies happening at a later date. What we're asking is that TVA get into alignment and provide leadership where they actually get to the 2030 goal. Let's get all the cards out on the table. Let's see what these costs are. And then while we're designing this clean electricity standard, let's see if those mechanisms can actually be used to either minimize or diminish any sort of rate impacts. I believe that TVA can get this done and get it done in a way that does not have significant cost impacts to customers. But again, as I stated at the very beginning of this, the alternative, doing nothing, is not a no-cost scenario. There are costs being hit on our communities today from climate change, from the lack of activity and the lack of action and the years of dumping so much carbon into the atmosphere. So this isn't a zero-sum game. Maggie, do you want to add anything about any of the mechanisms with the clean electricity standard that may be safety valves for the cost issues?
I think that was a great summary. And yeah, I'll add that, just again, that we think it's important that, it's not a clean electricity standard on its own, but there's both, carrots that go along with if the CES is the stick that can help utilities, move away from these fossil resources. I'll also add on the cost piece that, especially when we're looking at utilities that are continuing to invest in fossil resources, that is actually a huge risk to increase costs on customers. And the main reason for that is that these resources are going to quickly become what's called stranded assets. And that's kind of like if you get behind on your mortgage, or your house is basically worth less than you owe on it. So these, especially if TVA is looking at building new fossil gas resources, it could leave its customers on the hook for paying, billions of dollars for plants that it can't even use at that point.
Okay, thank you both for answering that. Our next question, what, if any, state or local incentives are needed to encourage more distributed energy production? Or do you assume that TVA should provide all of such incentives or assistance? Or do you think public support and market forces will spur more DER output?
It's a great question. We believe that there should be more opportunities for local governments and local incentives. Unfortunately, in the TVA region, that is hampered for a number of factors. One, unfortunately, there's a significant group of state level and even local level leaders that are still in denial about the significance of climate change. So we're not seeing proactive climate change policies, particularly at the state level. TVA has a chokehold grip on local power companies and their ability to actually do more. We've seen these very onerous 20-year contracts that have a very small percentage of opportunity for local municipal-owned utilities, the local power companies, to be able to do more. And so there's not, it's like a muscle. It's never exercised because TVA has so much regulatory control over the local power companies. There's not a lot of activity in local governments to be able to work with their local power companies to be able to work on incentives and other types of programs. We have been very vocal and continue to advocate for the local power companies to have more flexibility and freedom to be able to engage on these issues. And that way you can develop partnerships between local governments and their local municipalities. And then TVA has not honestly been that forthcoming in really trying to encourage these types of local government incentives and other things like that. And I think these are opportunities for a great deal of growth. Again, unfortunately, in most of our southern states, we have regressive legislative and gubernatorial leadership, administrative leadership on the issue of climate change. That is what it is, but it does not, it is not configured in a way that solves this problem. And this is why I think federal leadership is so important.
Thanks, Steve.
I could add a little bit here too. This is Brian Jacob. I lead the solar program for SACE, and the majority of the distributed resource, the customer generated distributed resource that we see is solar. So I would just add that the markets where we're seeing the highest penetration of distributed resource solar are the markets that are offering true retail net metering. And to Steve's point, TVA has this chokehold over the LPCs and won't allow them to offer that mechanism within the Tennessee Valley. So I think that the policy change that would make the biggest difference is if TVA would allow LPCs to encourage self-generation by offering a true retail net metering rate.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Let's get into some of the actual resources that we looked at in the report itself. There's a question about what do you include in energy efficiency? I think Maggie can take that one.
Yep. So energy efficiency well, there's a lot of more details on this in the appendix, so I hope that you'll check that out. But it's a pretty broad category in our analysis. So it includes both traditional energy efficiency programs as we've seen them for decades, but also some of the innovative things that we've been seeing around the country through things like rate design, smart homes, smart technologies. It involves energy efficiency for all types of customers, residential, commercial, and industrial, as well as some programs that focus on low-income communities.
Thank you, Maggie. Okay, this next question is about nuclear. Existing nuclear is neither clean or safe. Please explain your inclusion of it in the CES report. What is the justification for tolerating license extensions to 80 years, particularly for the 3 Browns Ferry reactors that are GE Mark I Fukushima style?
Yeah, I can start with this one, and then Steve, do you want to start?
No, you go ahead, and you can talk about the analysis, and then I'll address the licensing stuff.
So, so we actually kind of got around answering this one in the fact that we looked at 2030 for TVA, and all of TVA's nuclear plants, their current operating licenses do extend through 2030. So we got away from saying whether or not Browns Ferry would have a license extension within this analysis.
Yeah, and look, this is probably one of the most vexing issues that are on the table that I think a lot that we've got to deal with as a society. There is a significant amount of carbon-free energy that is being generated by existing nuclear reactors. Those reactors were built decades ago. They have already had license extensions beyond what they were designed to operate. They were originally designed for 40 years. Most have been extended to 60 years. And as the question iterates, there's now a discussion about extending them to 80 years. Let's be honest about this. These reactors were designed for a lifetime. So they're being pushed beyond their design life criteria. Most of them have been uprated, meaning that they've actually been, they're being pushed to work harder than they were designed to work. And there is, in our opinion, there's been some decrease in the overall regulatory environment because the NRC seems to be rubber stamping a lot of these license extensions. So when you have reactors that were designed longer, that are being pushed harder than they were designed, longer than they were designed, in a weaker regulatory environment, that is a prescription for real problems. And so we're very concerned about that. But it is also a fact that climate change is real. It's a very pressing problem. And so it's not an easy decision just to flip the switch off on all the existing reactors. And so SACE's position right now is that we need to look at evaluating the license extensions. We need to evaluate each one of those very, very carefully. We need to look at ways to be moving away from the nuclear technology longer term. We're not fans of the SMRs. We think they're unproven at this point. TVA wants to dabble in it, that's fine, but we don't believe that it should be a key piece of their carbon strategy to meet and they're not even talking about it meeting the goal by 2030, let alone by 2035. So there's a lot of thorny issues here that we're working through. I think it's a great question. But you know, we do not see it as an option that you can just immediately flip the switch and shut all of the reactors down today. And so what we've got to do is we've got to rapidly ramp up on the alternatives and see where we can get as fast as we can get. And that's why Maggie's point of, you know, we need to quit talking about this and we need to be deploying these resources to scale much, much faster. And particularly in TVA's case, TVA is lagging far behind their peers. You're going to see that next week in a report that will release, our 4th annual solar report. And so there are things that TVA can be doing that gives us more options, but remaining highly dependent on, you know, 60-plus-year-old technology that's being pushed as harder than it was designed to and longer than it's designed to is not a good prescription in our opinion.
Okay, thanks, Steve and Maggie. And I realize that we are over time. We've had really great Q&A session. I want to ask one more question and just remind everyone that we will be sending out a recording of the webinar later this afternoon, as well as the 3 other webinars that we're hosting on the report. So if you need to go do something else, you'll get that in your inbox later today. So just to kind of close this out, Maggie, if you could let us know what are the biggest takeaways for what TVA needs to do that might differentiate it from other utility systems analyzed in the report, and what can we do to support a clean electricity standard to reach that 2030 clean electricity goal?
This is a great question, great way to kind of end this conversation. But again, this is just the beginning of the conversation, so we'll get more into more of this throughout. You know, more analysis that we do and more reports that we have coming out. But a few of these we've already gone over, and I will touch on them. First off is the distributed solar piece, distributed energy piece, which Brian and Steve went over, and I think that was a great way to talk about that and think about that. And so I won't go more into that, but the other one is energy efficiency. TVA is very, very near the bottom of the Southeast on the energy savings that it gets every year from energy efficiency. For reference, the national average for that is 1%, and TVA is at 0.02% as a percentage of retail sales. So that's just got to come way up, and that's where TVA needs to start. You know, right now, today, it has the means to do that. So those are 2 of the keys. The third one that we didn't get into very much on this webinar, but that's also important, is that TVA appears to be planning to build a lot of new fossil gas resources between now and 2030. In fact, some of the you know, biggest new gas plans of any utility in the Southeast, and that it goes without saying, or it's pretty obvious, if you are building new gas resources, you can't get to 0 carbon. So that's something else they can do, is shift away, don't spend resources, you know, looking at or planning to build these gas plants, and instead let's, you know, go on energy efficiency and solar and proven clean electricity resources.
Great, that is a great way to end the webinar. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. And of course, thank you to the panelists for doing the analysis and answering our questions. We'll send this out later today, and have a great rest of your day.